change, that one could alter Jewish law into the interest of spiritual or somehow higher notions. An idea that's completely foreign to traditional Jewish ideas, but very much in the strength of those who have been exposed to Christianity. Further, the situation in Europe is just such that, in general, people expected a kind of apocalypse. That was just in the air in the 17th century. Christians, Jews, Muslims, basically everybody thought the world was about to end in a very, very intense way. Comets started appearing, all kinds of weird stuff was happening, and people were really convinced the world was about to end. Further, we also have printing that's taken off. Now, printing is one of these things that disseminates ideas very, very rapidly. And that's one of the great things about printing. You can disseminate ideas very rapidly. You can also disseminate ideas that are incorrect very rapidly. And what you get are all these bizarre broadsheets being printed in Europe that are making claims that are completely crazy. That, where's one example of this? One good example of this is that all the Jews that were the 10 lost tribes of Israel, they had returned in Saudi Arabia, what is now Saudi Arabia. They returned to Arabia. They had amassed a giant army led by this general, and that the 10 tribes of Israel had overtaken Mecca and had destroyed Mecca. They had conquered Islam. This idea is completely nuts. It's not grounded in any history at all. But there were repeated broadsheets printed through Europe where people really did believe that the 10 tribes of Europe were literally about to reconquer Israel and bring about peace in the world. This was a very common idea. So this kind of dissemination of bonkers notions were very, very popular. Not just that, there's all kinds of things going on in Europe that led people to believe the world was about to undergo some big change. Columbus's discovery of the so-called New World. There were the ongoing religious wars, the Hundred Years' War, the Protestant Reformation. There's tons of talk about Antichrist. Everybody was the Antichrist. Protestants, some of Pope was the Antichrist. Some Pope thought Martin Luther was the Antichrist. There's the witch trials. There are all kinds of things going on. If you want to get an idea about this time period, right, I'm sure most folks have heard of Bishop Nostradamus, right? Nostradamus is famous for his quatrains, prophetic quatrains. He dies in 1566. It's around, he's living in certainly roughly this time. So what's going on here is that the entire world is basically expecting a kind of messianic or apocalyptic event. And so, in some ways, had it not been Shabbatai Tzvi, it'd have been somebody else. I really am convinced of that. It just happened to be Shabbatai Tzvi. Also, there's a huge massacre in Poland that kills thousands, tens of thousands, maybe even 100,000. In fact, the Kaminsky pogrom or Kaminsky uprising may have been the largest single killing of Jews prior to the Holocaust, which also occurred in Poland. And there was this massive killing, maybe of 100,000 Jews. We're not sure how many died, but it was probably the largest mass killing of Jews until the Holocaust. And also, again, we have this messianic expectation that emerges after of this giant massacre. And it's into that situation that we meet Shabbatai Tzvi. Shabbatai is born into a mercantile family on Tisha B'Av and on Shabbat. That's why it's called Shabbatai. It's not uncommon it wasn't uncommon then, at least, for people born on Shabbat to be named Shabbatai. It's fun to be born on Shabbat. Now, no one calls their kids Shabbatai anymore because of how bad Shabbatai Tzvi's reputation has become. But he's also born on Tisha B'Av. You may know this, that on Tisha B'Av, it's a custom in Echa Rabbah, the Midrash, that the Messiah is going to be born on Tisha B'Av. As you probably know, Tisha B'Av is the saddest day on the Jewish calendar. It's the day of mourning. It's when all these bad things happen. The temple's destroyed, and World War I started, and all kinds of bad things. The Warsaw Ghetto Uprising was crushed. All kinds of bad things happen on Tisha B'Av. It's a day of mourning. Well, the idea from Echa Rabbah is that the Messiah will be born on Tisha B'Av. It will convert the day of mourning into a day of celebration. So already we have Shabbatai being born on just the right day, not just being born on Tisha B'Av, but also being born on Shabbat. And this is already an auspicious start here in 1626 in Izmir, Turkey. Izmir, as you may know, is the site of ancient Ephesus. So I've been to Izmir. That's the site of ancient Ephesus. By the 1640s, as Shabbatai is growing a little older, he begins to practices already. He's not involved in Rothschild practices in his family. He begins to turn his attention to ascetic practices. And he begins to drown himself, I would say, in reading the Sefer Zohar and the Sefer Hakana. The Sefer Hakana is a book where a student questions a teacher about the various laws, and the teacher tells the student why we do the laws the way we do. The idea of questioning the law is going to be a big part of Shabbatai's life, as we can see in each bit. Also, it's around this time that Shabbatai, around his teens, that he has this vision of this experience of his penis being damaged by a demon. It's not clear exactly what happened, but sexual issues will plague Shabbatai his entire life. And so the idea that he's being afflicted by the demoness Na'amah, who's a demoness in the Zohar, you may know her better, that's the name of Noah's wife, actually. But this demoness Na'amah, who we find in Zohar, is said to have done something to Shabbatai's penis and causes him all kinds of problems. And it's around this time in his teenage years, he also begins to experience these periods of what he calls illumination and darkness. These periods of illumination are periods where he doesn't sleep, he is singing and dancing, he's doing all kinds of strange behaviors, and these will last for several weeks, and then he will be plunged into a period of darkness where he basically won't get out of bed. He's sure everything is the worst, everything's terrible. So he's probably suffering. Most psychologists I've talked to diagnose him after he's done the course as something like manic depression. But he also, at the same time, he now begins to claim that he can do supernatural things like levitate. In fact, he claimed to levitate in front of several of his friends. His friends said he really didn't levitate, and then he told them that he just didn't deserve to see him, because they weren't righteous enough, they weren't pure enough, that he really did levitate according to Shabbatai. His family tries to fix him by marrying him off, which is the common solution for things back in the day. Just get married and things will get better. Shabbatai refused to consummate either marriage. He basically would not have sex with these women. And these women complained that Shabbatai was basically just studying the Zohar all the time, these illuminations and darkness fits. He wouldn't have sex with them, and his marriage is resolved. And of course, as you imagine, this is a huge problem for his family. It's a huge embarrassment for his family. But he just refuses to have sex with these women for whatever reason, and they divorce him. So he's twice divorced by the summer of 1648. And on June 11th, 1648, he has a vision of Prophet Elijah coming to him and telling him that he is the Messiah, basically anointing him and making him into the Messiah. And we're told that he began to exude fragrance from his body. So this is a thing that's commonly talked about Shabbatai's feet, is that he smelled really good. He had this intense fragrance coming off his body constantly. And so he told some of his close friends and his family that he was the Messiah. I don't know how they responded to this, because he kept it pretty secret. In the aftermath of him thinking he was the Messiah, secretly by 1651, Shabbatai is kicked out of his home. He is exiled from his homeland. He's kicked out, he's exiled, for reasons that aren't terribly clear exactly. But one of the things that we do know that he was doing at this time was that during prayers, he was enunciating the divine name of God during prayer. This is a no-no in Judaism. You're not allowed to say God's name. And Shabbatai was doing this in prayer, along with other strange things he was up to. And this eventually led to him being kicked out of the community of Israel. He'll come back with vengeance. The period that he's roaming around is typically referred to as the years of darkness by the community of folks who believe in Shabbatai's feet. The period of the years of darkness has him traveling around all through the Mediterranean world. We don't know his exact itinerary, but we know he travels all around Egypt and the Mediterranean, Eastern Mediterranean basin, and he did some strange things. He would settle in the really heavily Kabbalistic city of Salonika, and what is now Greece, and there he publicly married a Torah scroll. That also was not a thing he should do. That got him kicked out of Salonika. He seems to have made a pretty strong impression on people as he traveled. Now, making a strong impression is not making a good impression, and so he often made a bad impression on people because they thought he was crazy, or he was a prophet, or a Kabbalist, or whatever. But he made an impression on people no matter where he went, and eventually job being basically a fundraiser. What he would do is he would go to Jerusalem and he would raise money for the community there. The community in Jerusalem was notoriously poor, and what he would do is he would go back and forth raising money from local folks trying to get the Jerusalem community back online. It was actually on one of these missions of fundraising back in Cairo that an orphan from the massacres that I mentioned in Poland earlier actually had arrived in Cairo, and she was a piece of work herself. She was a pretty famous sex worker, and she was a former orphan that had been orphaned by the massacres in Poland, and she traveled all the way through places like Livorno and Amsterdam, where she eventually made her way to Cairo, and she made her name as a pretty famous sex worker, something like not exactly a courtesan, but famous sex worker. And when Shabbatai was in Cairo, he actually heard about her reputation, and one of the things that she claimed was that she would marry the Messiah. That was her big claim to fame, is that she would marry the Messiah, and Shabbatai, already having ideas that he was in fact the Messiah, took this as a sign, sent for her. She was a little more at the time. He sent for her, and she came to Cairo, and he married her in the house of this really famous Jewish leader in Cairo. And he did this probably as part of his messianic buildup, because as you may know, the prophet Hosea also married a sex worker as a sign of his prophecy that he was acting out his prophecy by marrying this sex worker. And what's interesting is that Sarah basically remained loyal to him until she died. She was with him all the way in his very tumultuous life, as we'll see. She died in 1674, and they were divorced briefly, but they were together for their basically entire whole life. And so they lived there for about a year until Shabbatai eventually made his way back to Jerusalem. But on the way to Jerusalem, he stops in Gaza. He stops in Gaza because he wants to meet a young and up-and-coming Kabbalist. That young and up-and-coming Kabbalist is a 23-year-old Nathan ben Elisha Chaim Levi Ashkenazi. Nathan of Gaza is probably one of the leading up-and-coming Kabbalist minds of the time. From his writings, you can see that he understands not just Kabbalah in general, but he also even understands really higher level debates that are going on inside of Kabbalah. So he even knows that there are specific schools of Luria and Kabbalah, and Nathan of Gaza is actually wading into the waters of these really technical debates around the nature of Kabbalah as it's being developed. Now, what ends up happening is Nathan of Gaza is also himself not just a mystic, but a prophet, and he's having visions. He begins to have visions as a young man, and these visions are such that he becomes kind of a mystical healer. Now, that idea of a mystical healer isn't completely foreign to Judaism. We actually see the same idea, for instance, in Zacharia. Zacharia is a physician of the soul, as they're sometimes referred to. And there's the idea that people like Luria and Nathan of Gaza can cure spiritual diseases that you have by diagnosing those spiritual diseases and by giving you a tikkun or a cure, a reparation, and that cure will fix your spiritual illness. It will solve your spiritual problems. And so it seems like what ends up happening is that Shabbatai actually travels to Gaza to meet with Nathan, and to basically become cured of his what we might call manic depression, the cycles of elimination and darkness. Well, what ends up happening is that he ends up traveling to Gaza. He stays with Nathan for several weeks. And in the several weeks, they go on these very long walks. They walk from Gaza to Jerusalem, which is quite a long walk. And they also walk from Jerusalem to Hebron. And it's in those walks that eventually Nathan tells Shabbatai that Shabbatai is the Messiah. He lays it on Shabbatai. He's like, not only can I not cure you, but you don't need to be cured, you're the Messiah. And Shabbatai says, look, I know that I'm the Messiah, but I'm not. I gave it up. I knew that I could be a Messiah, but I gave it up. He seems to be one of his dark periods in this whole business. What ends up happening eventually is that Nathan eventually announces the entire Shabbatai is the Messiah business in near Shavuot 1665. And Nathan is possessed by this Magid spirit. It's all incredibly weird. And eventually, what ends up happening is that Shabtai is experiencing a profound one of these depression periods. And then 3 days later, he declares that he is, in fact, the Messiah. Now, again, people declaring that people are the Messiah is nothing new, period. People, every once in a while, come along and say they're the Messiah. And what typically happens is that no one believes them, or very few people believe them, and they get themselves killed. That's typically what ends up happening. Well, what ends up happening with Shabbatai is absolutely shocking. In Gaza, he declares he's the Messiah, and he announces that the fast of the 17th Tammuz is to be abolished, and he abolishes it. He does not observe the fast. And rather than observe the fast, he announces that the Hallel should be said. Hallel is what you say for praise. It's what you say in Sukkot for praise. And so rather than engage in the fast of the Tammuz, he declares that he has abolished it, that the days of Messiah are here, the days of fasting are over, we can now all celebrate. And he takes, at this point, he has about 40 followers, he takes them from Gaza to Jerusalem, and he declares himself the Messiah in Jerusalem. He says, I am the Messiah. He tries to get on top of the Temple Mount to perform a sacrifice, basically to try to inaugurate the realities of the temple. He also begins to refer to himself as the Amirah, and the Jerusalem community stops him. They're like, you're nuts, you're crazy, you cannot go on the Temple Mount, there's a mosque up there, you go up there, there's a mosque up there and try to kill an animal, like, you're gonna get in trouble, you're gonna get us all in trouble. So the local rabbis actually turn him over to the local Qadis. The Qadis, basically the mayor of Jerusalem, the Turkish mayor of Jerusalem, and they turn him over to the Qadi and they say, this guy's crazy. You need to arrest him. He's going to do something bizarre. The Qadi doesn't arrest him. Not only does he not arrest him, he allows Shabbatai to go around on horseback around the city, waving a green banner. Now, riding around on a horse doesn't seem like a big deal, except for Jews weren't allowed to ride on horses. It was against Islamic law for Jews to ride on horses. It was an exclusive thing for Muslims. But for whatever reason, the Qadi of Jerusalem, just probably because he thinks this guy's crazy, lets him ride around, circle around Jerusalem, waving this green banner 7 times. And this is proof for Shabbatai's followers that he's actually important. He's actually the Messiah. Because he is able to basically not get arrested by the local Qadi, and he is allowed to circle the city on horseback 7 times, sort of summoning up some Jericho imagery. Further, he allows his followers to eat forbidden food, certain parts of the animal, which the Bible declares to be unkosher. He says to his followers they're allowed to do. He allows them to engage in violations of Jewish law. These violations of Jewish law, he develops, even has a special blessing for violating Jewish law on purpose. And eventually the rabbis at Jerusalem send a complaint against Shabbatai all the way to the chief rabbi of the Ottoman Empire in Istanbul. Well, what ends up happening, Shabbatai is run out of Jerusalem. The Jerusalem community, which previously liked him, at least to some degree, they liked him singing. He was a very good singer, very charismatic. They run him out of Jerusalem, and what ends up happening, Shabbatai departs for Aleppo, which is now in modern Syria. And what happens there is that Nathan's already sent letters ahead of Shabbatai to the folks of Aleppo, specifically letters explaining, using very complex Kabbalistic justifications, things like the treatise of the dragons and other kinds of documents, that Shabbatai is in fact the Messiah, and that they need to welcome him as the Messiah. Well, it's not clear exactly how and why the folks at Aleppo were so heavily convinced of the letters that Nathan of Gaza wrote, but they were clearly convinced of them because when he arrives in Aleppo, it is a fanfare, ticker-tape parade for Shabbatai speak. He is welcomed into Aleppo with open arms. He's openly declared the Messiah. He stays there for about 3 weeks, and it is a complete wave of enthusiasm. There are people prophesying in the streets that the Messiah has come. He basically converts much of the crowd of Aleppo, most of the Jewish community of Aleppo, to him. He basically works under the same messianism. And he gets perhaps one of his most important allies at this time. That important ally is the son of Hussein Tal. Hussein Tal, his son, Rabbi Hussein Tal is one of the main one of the main people responsible for the Messiah or for the Kabbalah. He's been dead now, but his son is living in Aleppo, and his son declares that Shabbatai is the Messiah. So it's like having the son of the most important Kabbalist of all time basically declaring that this guy's the Messiah in Aleppo. It is a huge explosion in enthusiasm that he received in Aleppo. After spending 22 days in Aleppo, Nathan is still back in Gaza. He finished writing letters. He's writing tracts, prayer books, and prophecies. He's sending these all over the Jewish world. You could not ask for a better PR man than Nathan of Gaza. And Nathan is sending this stuff everywhere. Everybody's getting it. People are very excited about the things that Shabbatai can do allegedly. And what ends up happening is that Shabbatai makes his way back home to Israel. And as soon as he gets there, well, he falls into depression. He's in the depression for weeks, and it's not until Hanukkah of that year that he emerges from the depression. And it's around this time that the local rabbi gets the writ of excommunication, basically, or gets what will become the writ of excommunication from Istanbul. And sometime around Hanukkah of that year, there is an explosion of tension. There are the pro-Shabbatai people and the anti-Shabbatai people. And what ends up happening is the anti-Shabbatai guy actually is giving prayers on the Sabbath. And Luke Shabbatai grabs an axe and hacks his way on the Sabbath into the Portuguese synagogue and then chases the other rabbi out of the building. He says he cleansed it of the evil forces that were inside the synagogue, and then he sets himself up as kind of a king inside the Portuguese synagogue after chasing the rabbi out with an axe, basically. Not only that, the guy who he chased out, the rabbi who he chased out, the own town, that rabbi's daughters fall into prophetic fits, declaring Shabbatai to be the Messiah. So this guy's getting from all sides. He's being chased around by Shabbatai with an axe, and his own daughters are falling into these enthusiastic trances, declaring that Shabbatai is the Messiah. He does the same thing. He pronounces the divine name. There's all kinds of things that begin to go on. He sings Christian songs in the synagogue. He allows women to come to the Bima to become the Torah. There's all kinds of things he begins to do when he's back in Izmir that are rapidly raising the ire of the local of the larger Jewish communal world. It's around this time also that he consummates his marriage with his wife. Apparently, he had not done that yet, and she shows the bloody cloth that prove that the marriage had been consummated to great fanfare. And so all kinds of things happen here at Izmir that are slowly earning the attention of the wider world. This guy Shabbatai is really beginning to act out in very, very strange ways. So on December 30th, at the end of the year, he sets sails with some of his followers to Istanbul. Now, what's happened by the time that he set sails by the 30th of December is that in 1666, by early 1666, Nathan of Gaza's letters have reached everywhere. Everywhere. As far afield as Brazil. People in Brazil have heard about Shabbatai's feet by the time he sets sails and by the time he arrives in Istanbul in early 1666. He's famous. He's famous even before he reaches Istanbul. And so everywhere, London, Hamburg, Sanaa in Yemen, Amsterdam, everybody's heard about Shabbatai's feet, and everybody increasingly thinks he's the Messiah. By 1666, by the summer of 1666, the estimates range, but the general estimate is about half the world's Jewish population have become convinced that he's the Messiah. With some places, like the Amsterdam community, largely a converso community, basically having packed their bags and booked boats back to Israel because they were convinced that Shabbatai was literally about to take over the entire world. So that entire community, many people in that community, packed their bags, had them on the dock, they were waiting to go home back to Israel because Shabbatai had done the whole thing. So this was a overwhelming part of the Jewish community, at least half, maybe more. Even Spinoza weighed in about Shabbatai stuff. Spinoza knew about it. Sadly, we don't have Spinoza's letter, so we don't know exactly what was going on. Well, the trip from Izmir to Istanbul should only have taken a couple of weeks, but it took 39 days. It had very, very bad weather, and what ends up happening is that Shabbatai, the view of Shabbatai coming to Istanbul is ahead of him, and because it gets ahead of him, as soon as he arrives in Istanbul, he's arrested. The Turkish government knows what this guy is. They know what he's coming there to do. He's coming there basically to declare his messiahdom in Istanbul, the capital of the Ottoman Empire. And the idea, I think, is basically going to take over the Ottoman Empire. He's just going to take the whole thing over as the king of everything, the king of the Ottoman Empire. So he's arrested. He's been beaten up by one of the guards and thrown in jail. The jail he's thrown into is referred to by Shabbatians as the Tower of Strength. And he's put into captivity, but he's put into a very luxurious captivity. His followers, which at this point amass probably in the thousands, are sending enormous amounts of money to him. So that allows him to basically bribe his guards, and he lives in. He's kind of living like a king inside of this prison, basically. And it's inside this prison that he sees emissaries from Yemen, from Europe, from all over. And it's in this prison situation in the Migdal Oz that he begins to basically hold court as if he were a king. He's dressed like a king, acts like a king, and he is doing all kinds of things while he is imprisoned here in the beginning of 1666. And he's receiving, like I said, emissaries from all over. These emissaries really do believe that despite the fact that he's in prison, it's only a matter of time until he reveals that he really is the Messiah. So he's receiving emissaries from all over, and they are coming back and really preaching the gospel, so to speak, of Shabbatai Tzvi. And it's at this time in 1666 that the Shabbatian movement was at its peak, although it's only been really operating now for about 2 years. What ends up happening is that a hater basically ruins everything for him. This guy named Nehemiah Cohen arrives from Gallipoli, and he's heard about that Shabbatai Tzvi is the Messiah. He meets with him, and basically he becomes disillusioned. He thinks this guy's really not the Messiah. This guy's just a charlatan. He's not really the Messiah. It's probably because Nehemiah Cohen thought he was the Messiah. He's just enter Messiah thief. And he tells the Sultan, basically, or at least the emissaries of the Sultan, that this guy is a danger. He's living the life of luxury. He's engaged in all kinds of debaucherous activity. And what ends up happening is that on September 15th, 1666, Shabbatai is arrested, re-arrested. He's drawn in to see the Sultan, the Grand Vizier, and he's basically told, a very simple thing. He says, look, here's the skinny. They interrogated, asked him if he's a Messiah. He says, yes, he is a Messiah. So they said, okay, here's your test, right? Here's the test. I'll convert you to your religion. I'll convert you to Messiah. This is yeah, it was. So Brennan's always like against